What's up, history buffs? Today we're diving into the question that'll make your Sunday school teacher have a complete meltdown. How did the Borgias literally turn the Vatican into a brothel? And I'm not talking metaphorically here, folks. I'm talking about actual orgies in the papal apartments, prostitutes wandering the halls of St. Peter's, and a pope who had more mistresses than a Hollywood mogul. Forget everything you think you know about the Catholic Church, because the real story behind the Borgias is way more twisted than any Netflix series you've binged. Hit that like button if you never learned this in school, because trust me, they definitely didn't cover Pope Alexander VI's sex parties in your world history class. Let me paint you a picture. It's 1492, and while Columbus is bumbling around the Caribbean looking for India, back in Rome something far more scandalous is happening. Rodrigo Borgia has just bought his way to the papal throne, and I mean literally bought it, like ordering a pizza. The man spent the modern equivalent of millions in bribes to become Pope Alexander VI. But here's the kicker. This wasn't some holy man who lost his way. This was a guy who already had 4 acknowledged children from multiple mistresses, and he was just getting started. Picture the Vatican today. All marble columns, priceless art, and hushed reverence. Now imagine that same place, but with naked courtesans dancing on tables, cardinals passed out drunk in hallways, and the Pope himself hosting dinner parties that would make Hugh Hefner blush. That's exactly what Rome became under the Borgias, and by the time this family was done, they'd turned the seat of Christianity into the most notorious den of sin in Europe. The Borgias didn't just bend the rules. They took the entire concept of papal authority and turned it into their personal playground for power, sex, and violence. We're talking about a family that made murder a dinner conversation topic and treated the College of Cardinals like their personal board of directors for a criminal enterprise. And the most insane part? They almost got away with it. You thought House of Cards was dark? Wait until you hear about Cesare Borgia's midnight executions. You think modern politics is corrupt? These people were poisoning their dinner guests for sport. By the end of this story, you'll understand why the Borgias became synonymous with everything wrong with absolute power, and how one Spanish family managed to corrupt the most powerful institution in medieval Europe. Buckle up, because this story is about to completely blow your mind, and I haven't even gotten to the part where the Pope's daughter throws the most infamous orgy in Vatican history. In this part, you'll discover why Rodrigo Borgia was basically the medieval equivalent of a cartel boss who happened to wear papal robes. And trust me, that comparison isn't as crazy as it sounds. Let's rewind to 1431, when little Rodrigo Borgia is born in Spain. Now, his uncle happens to be Pope Calixtus III, which in medieval times was like having your uncle own the biggest corporation in the world. Nepotism? More like nephewism on steroids. By age 25, Rodrigo is already a cardinal, not because of his spiritual devotion, but because Uncle Pope basically handed him the keys to the kingdom. But here's where it gets interesting. Most people who get handed power that young either become totally incompetent or develop a god complex. Rodrigo? He chose option 3, become a criminal mastermind. The guy was brilliant, charismatic, and absolutely ruthless. He looked at the papal office and thought, you know what this needs? More organized crime. See, the Catholic Church in the 1400s was already pretty corrupt. We're talking about an institution that literally sold tickets to heaven called indulgences. But Rodrigo saw all that corruption and thought, amateurs. While other cardinals were content with their modest bribes and comfortable lifestyles, Rodrigo was building a network that would make the Medici family look like corner store owners. Letters discovered in Vatican archives reveal that even as a young cardinal, Rodrigo was already scandalizing Rome. Pope Pius VII actually wrote him a letter in 1460 basically saying, "Dude, tone it down with the parties." And this is coming from Renaissance Italy, where everyone was partying like it was 1499. When you're getting noise complaints from other Renaissance nobles, you know you're going hard. But the real genius move? Rodrigo understood that in medieval Europe, the Pope wasn't just a religious leader. He was the CEO of the wealthiest corporation on earth, the commander-in-chief of a military force, and the ultimate political kingmaker all rolled into one. Most popes focused on one aspect. Rodrigo wanted it all. By the time he's in his 50s, Rodrigo Borgia has accumulated wealth that would make Jeff Bezos jealous, political connections across every major European court, and enough dirt on every important family in Italy to blackmail his way to anything he wanted. And what he wanted was the ultimate prize, the papal tiara. The stage was set for the most corrupt papal election in history, and Rodrigo Borgia was about to show everyone how you really buy a church. You thought that was bad? Wait until you hear how Rodrigo literally turned the papal election into the world's most expensive auction, with the papacy going to the highest bidder. August 1492. Pope Innocent VIII has just died, and the College of Cardinals is gathering to elect his successor. Now, papal elections were always political, but what happened next was basically the medieval equivalent of an episode of Succession directed by Martin Scorsese. Rodrigo Borgia walked into that conclave with a war chest that historians estimate at around 100,000 ducats. That's roughly $20 million in today's money. But here's the beautiful part. He didn't just throw money around like some amateur. This man had done his homework. He knew exactly which cardinals could be bought, which ones needed to be threatened, and which ones required more creative persuasion. Cardinal Ascanio Sforza? Rodrigo promised him the vice-chancellorship and 4 mule loads of silver. Literally, mule loads. Cardinal Orsini got the fortress of Monticelli and the bishopric of Cartagena. Cardinal Colonna received the Abbey of Subiaco. It was like a medieval Black Friday sale, except instead of discounted electronics, they were selling the keys to Christianity. But my favorite detail comes from contemporary accounts. Rodrigo actually had his agents deliver the bribes during the conclave itself. While other cardinals were supposedly praying for divine guidance, Borgia's people were sliding bags of gold under doors like some kind of holy drug deal. Real talk. This next part is going to sound absolutely bonkers, but stick with me. When the final vote was counted, Rodrigo Borgia won by exactly the margin he had paid for. The man had mathematically calculated corruption. He became Pope Alexander VI, not through divine providence, but through what was essentially the most successful hostile takeover in religious history. And the best part? Everyone knew it was bought and paid for. The Venetian ambassador wrote back to his government that the papacy had been sold to the highest bidder. But here's the thing about medieval politics. Sometimes the most corrupt candidate is also the most competent one. Within hours of his election, Alexander VI had already started transforming the Vatican from a religious institution into his personal empire. And that empire was going to be built on 3 pillars: money, murder, and more sex scandals than a Hollywood tabloid. The coronation was just the beginning. The real show was about to start. This is where everything starts to fall apart for everyone except the Borgias, because Alexander VI wasn't content to just be a corrupt pope. He was about to turn the Vatican into a family business that would make the mafia jealous. First order of business? Getting his kids set up with proper careers. Now remember, Catholic priests are supposed to be celibate. But Alexander VI had 4 acknowledged children from his favorite mistress, Vanozza de Catane, and he was about to prove that nepotism could reach truly artistic levels. Meet the Borgia children, Juan, Cesare, Lucrezia, and Joffre. Think of them as the medieval equivalent of a crime family's next generation. Except instead of inheriting a restaurant that's definitely a front for money laundering, they're inheriting control over Western Christianity. Cesare Borgia gets made a cardinal at age 17. 17. This kid couldn't legally drink in most states today, but he's suddenly one of the most powerful religious figures in Europe. And spoiler alert, Cesare had about as much interest in religion as a vampire has in garlic bread. The man was already planning his transition from cardinal to warlord because apparently regular corruption wasn't exciting enough for him. Lucrezia gets married off to Giovanni Sforza, which sounds nice until you realize it's basically a political hostage situation designed to secure alliances. And when that marriage stops being useful, well, Let's just say the Borgias had very modern views on divorce, even when the church officially didn't recognize it. But here's where the Vatican brothel part really kicks into high gear. Alexander VI had moved his mistress, Giulia Farnese, who everyone called Giulia la Bella because she was basically the Renaissance equivalent of a supermodel, directly into the papal apartments. Not nearby, not in a discreet location, into the actual papal residence. Pause and think. Would you have the audacity to move your girlfriend into the Vatican while serving as the Pope? Because that's exactly what Alexander VI did. And when anyone complained, he basically responded with the medieval equivalent of, "What are you gonna do about it?" Drop a comment with your theory about what happens next. Because trust me, it gets so much worse. Contemporary accounts describe Giulia basically holding court in St. Peter's like she was the unofficial Popess. Cardinals were bowing to her. Important documents needed her approval. She was throwing parties in rooms that were supposed to be reserved for prayer and contemplation. The woman had turned papal politics into her personal reality show. Hold up. Before we continue, drop a comment if you think having your mistress run Vatican operations is the worst thing a pope can do, because you're about to find out it was just the warm-up act. By 1493, the Vatican had become less like a religious institution and more like the headquarters of a particularly ambitious crime syndicate. Alexander VI had basically looked at the concept of separation of church and state and decided to merge them into Church and State Crime Solutions, LLC. Here's where things get really wild. The Pope started hosting dinner parties that would make ancient Roman emperors blush. We're talking about events where cardinals, diplomats, and wealthy Romans would gather in the papal apartments for evenings that combined political networking with activities that definitely weren't covered in seminary school. Johann Burchard, who was basically the Vatican's event coordinator, kept detailed diaries of these parties. And let me tell you, this man had seen some stuff. His descriptions read like someone documenting the decline of civilization in real time. He writes about dinners where courtesans entertained guests, where political deals were made over wine that cost more than most people's annual income, and where the Pope himself would preside over it all like some kind of unholy game show host. But the real genius of Alexander VI's operation was how he monetized everything. You want a church position? That'll cost you. Need a papal dispensation for your politically convenient marriage? Payment required. Want your sins forgiven? There's literally a price list. The man had turned salvation into a subscription service, and it wasn't just small-time corruption. Alexander VI was selling cardinalships like they were luxury cars. In 1503, he created 12 new cardinals in one day and charged each of them between 10,000 and 20,000 ducats. That's roughly $2 to $4 million per cardinal in today's money. He made $30 million in a single afternoon by basically franchising holiness. The most insane part? It was working. Money was pouring into the Vatican faster than ever before. The papal states were expanding. The Borgia family was accumulating power across Italy. Alexander VI had proven that corruption, when done with enough style and intelligence, could be incredibly effective. But power without limits tends to create people without limits. And the Borgia children were about to show Europe what happened when you gave unlimited resources to ambitious sociopaths. Plot twist incoming, because just when you think the Borgias couldn't get any more dysfunctional, Cesare Borgia decides being a cardinal is boring and he'd rather become a warlord. And his father, the Pope, totally supports this career change. Picture this. It's 1497. And Cesare Borgia is looking around at his life as a cardinal and thinking, you know what would be more fun than celibacy and prayer? Conquest and murder? So he goes to his dad and basically says, "Hey, Papa Pope, can I quit the church and become a professional killer instead?" And Alexander VI responds with what might be the most enabling parenting decision in history. "Sure, son. Let me help you with that." This is where the Vatican truly becomes a family crime operation. Alexander VI uses his papal authority to get Cesare released from his cardinal vows, something that was supposed to be impossible, and then helps him marry into French nobility to secure military backing. It's like if the CEO of a major corporation helped his son start a competing business using company resources. But here's the really twisted part. Alexander VI starts using church funds to finance Cesare's military campaigns. We're talking about money that was supposed to go toward feeding the poor, maintaining churches, and spreading Christianity. Instead, it's buying weapons, hiring mercenaries, and funding what was essentially a medieval hostile takeover of central Italy. Cesare's methods were, let's call them innovative. The man had a talent for political assassination that would make modern intelligence agencies take notes. He'd invite rival nobles to dinner, and they'd mysteriously die of sudden illness. He'd arrange hunting accidents for inconvenient politicians. He'd have bandits attack convoys carrying people who opposed his plans. Letters discovered in Mantuan archives reveal that other Italian nobles were genuinely terrified of Cesare. These were people who lived in a world where political murder was fairly common, and they thought Cesare Borgia was too extreme. When you're making Renaissance Italians uncomfortable with your violence levels, you might be overdoing it. Real talk. Does this remind you of anything happening today? Let me know below, because the parallels between the Borgias and modern authoritarian families are honestly terrifying. The Vatican had become the headquarters for a military dictatorship, funded by church money, blessed by papal authority, and run by a family that treated Europe like their personal game of Risk. And this is where our story takes a hard left turn into territory so dark, it makes Game of Thrones look like a Disney movie, because the Borgia family was about to prove that power really does corrupt absolutely. June 1497. Juan Borgia, Alexander VI's oldest son, and the Duke of Gandia, goes out for dinner in Rome. Normal Tuesday night, right? Except Juan never comes home. The next morning, his body is pulled from the Tiber River with 9 stab wounds and his throat cut. Someone had very professionally murdered the Pope's son. Now, here's where it gets really messed up. The primary suspect? His own brother Cesare. See, Juan was the heir to the family legacy, but Cesare was the one with the ambition and the psychopathic skill set needed to actually run a criminal empire. So when Juan became inconvenient to Cesare's plans, well, let's just say Cesare was very good at solving problems permanently. Alexander VI was devastated by Juan's death. But here's the thing about the Borgias. Grief was temporary, but power was forever. Within months, the Pope had shifted all of Juan's titles and resources to Cesare. It was like the world's most morbid promotion ceremony. But the real scandal that had all of Europe talking wasn't the murder. Political assassination was Tuesday in Renaissance Italy. It was what happened at the Vatican on October 30th, 1501. Buckle up, because I'm about to tell you about the most infamous party in papal history. Lucrezia Borgia decided to throw what historians call the Banquet of Chestnuts. Now that sounds innocent enough, right? Like maybe they played some board games and ate seasonal snacks? Wrong. So very, very wrong. According to Johann Burchard's diary, and remember this guy was literally the Vatican's official record keeper, Lucrezia invited 50 courtesans to the papal apartments for an evening of entertainment. And when I say entertainment, I mean activities that would get the Vatican shut down by health inspectors if they happened today. The party apparently involved naked courtesans crawling around on the floor collecting chestnuts, with prizes awarded to the cardinals who could, let's say, perform the most times with the guests. And this wasn't happening in some back alley brothel. This was happening in the papal apartments, with the Pope and his family watching like it was the halftime show at the Super Bowl. If you're as shocked as I was reading this, hit that like button, because honestly, I had to fact-check this story 3 times before I believed it was real. Let's pause here and think about what this actually means, because we're not just talking about a wild party. We're talking about the moment when the Vatican officially became indistinguishable from a high-end brothel, and the Pope's family were the ones running it. The Banquet of Chestnuts wasn't an aberration. It was the logical conclusion of everything the Borgias had been building toward. They had systematically stripped away every boundary between sacred and profane, between holy and criminal, between spiritual authority and personal pleasure. Think about the symbolism here. Chestnuts were gathered from the floor by naked women while cardinals, men who had supposedly devoted their lives to God, competed to see who could be the most sexually active. The Pope of the Catholic Church was essentially hosting a pornographic game show in the building that was supposed to represent the earthly presence of divine authority. But here's what makes this even more twisted. Alexander VI wasn't ashamed of any of this. Contemporary accounts suggest he was proud of his family's parties, like they were some kind of cultural achievement. The man had so completely divorced himself from any concept of religious propriety that he genuinely seemed to think turning the Vatican into Caligula's palace was just good leadership. European courts were horrified, but also fascinated. Ambassadors would write back to their kings with detailed accounts of Vatican debauchery, but they kept showing up to the parties. It was like a train wreck that doubled as the most exclusive nightclub in Europe. And meanwhile, Cesare Borgia was using these parties as political networking events. While cardinals were distracted by the entertainment, Cesare was making deals, gathering intelligence, and identifying potential allies or enemies. The man had turned orgies into intelligence operations. The most insane part? It was still working. Money kept flowing into the Vatican. The Borgia family kept accumulating power. European nobles kept paying tribute and seeking papal favors. Alexander VI had proven that you could literally turn Christianity's holiest site into a brothel and still maintain political authority as long as you were smart enough about how you did it. But power built on scandal is ultimately unstable, and the Borgias were about to learn that even the most successful criminal enterprises eventually face consequences. Before we continue, could something like this happen today? Comment below, because the answer might be more disturbing than you think. By 1503, the Borgias had been running their Vatican crime syndicate for 11 years, and they seemed unstoppable. Alexander VI was still Pope. Cesare controlled most of central Italy through a combination of military conquest and strategic assassination, and Lucrezia had been married off to the Duke of Ferrara, giving the family influence in northern Italy as well. But here's the thing about building an empire on corruption. It requires constant energy to maintain. The moment you stop actively managing all the moving pieces, everything starts falling apart. And in August 1503, the Borgias were about to face the one enemy they couldn't bribe, intimidate, or murder: biology. Alexander VI and Cesare both fell violently ill after a dinner party. Now, given the Borgia family's reputation for poisoning their enemies, everyone immediately assumed they had been poisoned by rivals. The irony was just too perfect. The family that had murdered dozens of people with poison finally getting a taste of their own medicine. But modern historians think it was probably just malaria, which was rampant in Rome during the summer months. Sometimes the most dramatic families meet the most mundane ends. Alexander VI died on August 18, 1503, at age 72. And almost immediately, everything the Borgias had built started collapsing like a house of cards in a hurricane. See, the entire Borgia power structure was built around Alexander VI's papal authority. Without that, Cesare was just another Italian warlord with too many enemies and not enough loyal allies. The territories he had conquered through murder and intimidation immediately started rebelling. The cardinals he had bribed or threatened began plotting revenge. The noble families he had destroyed started planning their comeback. Cesare, still recovering from his illness, tried desperately to maintain control. He actually managed to influence the next papal election enough to get Pius III elected, but Pius died after just 26 days in office. When Giuliano della Rovere became Pope Julius II, Cesare's fate was sealed. Julius II had been one of Alexander VI's biggest enemies, and he had a very long memory. The speed of the collapse was breathtaking. Within months, Cesare Borgia went from being one of the most feared men in Europe to a political refugee fleeing from one court to another, trying to find someone willing to protect him from his former victims. The Vatican brothel was officially closed for business. You thought this was a story about corruption triumphing over morality. Plot twist. It's actually a story about why unsustainable systems always eventually destroy themselves, no matter how clever the people running them. Julius II didn't just want to undo the Borgias' legacy, he wanted to erase it completely. One of his first acts as pope was to literally fumigate the papal apartments. Not metaphorically, he had them actually fumigated, like they were cleaning up after a plague outbreak. The new pope also launched what was basically a medieval audit of everything Alexander VI had done. Church positions that had been sold were revoked unless the holders could prove they were actually qualified. Papal dispensations that had been bought were canceled. The elaborate financial schemes that had funded the Borgia Empire were dismantled. But the most poetic justice? Julius II commissioned Michelangelo to paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, creating one of the greatest religious artworks in history in the same building where the Borgias had hosted their orgies. It was like covering graffiti with the Mona Lisa. Cesare Borgia's end was almost anticlimactic after everything he had done. He eventually fled to Spain, where he died in 1507 during a minor military campaign, killed not by some master assassin or elaborate poison plot, but by soldiers in a completely forgettable battle. The man who had terrorized Italy for years ended up as a footnote in someone else's war. Lucrezia actually had the most successful post-scandal life. She became a genuinely respected duchess in Ferrara, patronized the arts, and apparently settled into a relatively normal existence. Sometimes the smartest move is to just stop being a sociopath and try being a regular person instead. But here's what I find most fascinating about the Borgia legacy. They almost worked. For 11 years, they proved that you could completely abandon every moral principle, turn religious authority into a criminal enterprise, and still maintain power and wealth. They came closer than anyone in history to successfully privatizing Christianity. Their failure wasn't moral, it was operational. They built a system that only worked as long as Alexander VI was alive to run it. The moment that central authority disappeared, everything collapsed because it was all held together by one man's charisma and ruthlessness. Let me know in the comments, who's the real villain here? The Borgias for being corrupt, or the system that allowed them to get away with it for so long? Take a second to process that, because we've just witnessed the rise and fall of what might be the most successful criminal organization in European history, and it was run out of the Vatican by a family that treated the Pope's office like a franchise opportunity. The Borgia story reveals something uncomfortable about power. It's not inherently moral or immoral. It's just a tool, and the Borgias used that tool with remarkable effectiveness for over a decade. They understood that institutions only have the authority people choose to give them, and that even the most sacred organizations can be corrupted if you're systematic enough about it. What makes their story particularly relevant today is how they managed to maintain legitimacy while being openly corrupt. Alexander VI never pretended to be a holy man. Everyone knew the papal elections were bought. The entire European political establishment was aware that the Vatican had become a criminal enterprise. But it continued to function because it still provided services that people needed: political mediation, financial services, military protection, and religious validation. The Borgias proved that people will tolerate almost unlimited corruption as long as the system still delivers results they want. European nobles kept paying tribute to Alexander VI not because they respected his moral authority, but because he had the power to help or hurt them. Cardinals kept participating in the corrupt system because they still got wealthy and influential positions out of it. But their downfall also reveals the ultimate weakness of purely transactional power. It only lasts as long as you can keep delivering benefits to enough people to maintain control. The moment Alexander VI died, all those carefully managed relationships collapsed because they were based on fear and greed rather than genuine loyalty or shared values. The Vatican had to be completely rebuilt as an institution after the Borgias. The Counter-Reformation, the Council of Trent, the creation of the Roman Inquisition, all of these were direct responses to the scandal of the Borgia papacy. The Catholic Church spent the next century trying to prove it could be trusted with moral authority again. In a weird way, the Borgias might have accidentally saved Christianity by showing everyone what it looked like when religious institutions became completely secular. Their excesses were so extreme that they created a backlash toward genuine reform and spiritual renewal. Here's the question that should keep you up at night. Were the Borgias a product of their time or just evil? Comment your take, because I think the answer reveals something pretty unsettling about human nature. The easy answer is to say they were uniquely terrible people who took advantage of a corrupt system. But that's not quite right. The Renaissance was full of corrupt nobles, murderous politicians, and sexually adventurous clergy. What made the Borgias special wasn't that they were more immoral than their contemporaries, it's that they were better at it. Alexander VI understood that power is ultimately about managing perceptions and delivering results. He created a system where European elites got what they wanted: political stability, profitable alliances, religious legitimacy for their actions, while he got what he wanted, which was unlimited personal authority and wealth. Everyone was complicit because everyone was benefiting. The real horror of the Borgia story isn't that they were cartoon villains. It's that they were highly intelligent, strategically brilliant people who made rational decisions to prioritize power over principle. They looked at the world around them, calculated what they could get away with, and systematically pushed every boundary until they had transformed the Vatican from a religious institution into a family business. And for over a decade, it worked perfectly. The lesson isn't that corruption always fails. The Borgias failed because Alexander VI died, not because their system was inherently unstable. If he had lived another 10 years and successfully transferred power to Cesare, we might be telling a very different story about how a Spanish family conquered Europe through the Catholic Church. What should really terrify you is how easily normal people adapted to the Borgia system. Cardinals who started their careers as genuine religious figures gradually became complicit in orgies and murder conspiracies. Diplomats who represented Christian nations learned to navigate a Vatican that operated like a mafia organization. European nobles who claimed to be defending Christian values continued paying tribute to a pope who had turned St. Peter's into a brothel. The Borgias didn't destroy the Vatican through force. They corrupted it through offering people exactly what they wanted and making the price of resistance higher than the price of cooperation. So here's my final question. If you lived in Renaissance Italy and cooperating with the Borgias could make you wealthy and powerful, while opposing them could get you murdered, what would you have done? And more importantly, what does that tell us about how corruption spreads in any system where the incentives are structured to reward the wrong behavior? Drop your verdict below. Were the Borgias evil geniuses, products of their time, or something else entirely? Because understanding how they succeeded might be the key to recognizing similar patterns before they take over the institutions we trust today. The Vatican survived the Borgias and eventually reformed itself. The question is whether our modern institutions are strong enough to survive their own versions of Alexander VI, Cesare, and Lucrezia Borgia. What do you think?